Good evening. I'd like to say good evening to all of you, and thank you for coming out this evening to see what promises to be a really interesting talk by Dr. Chuck Geschke, founder of Adobe Systems. It's my duty just to mention that this is one in a series of talks that the Technology, Innovation, and Global Security program of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law is sponsoring this semester. We're having talks roughly every 2 weeks. Last week we heard from Morris Chang, chair of Taiwan Semiconductor. This week we're delighted to have the very distinguished Dr. Chuck Geschke from Adobe Systems. In 2 weeks we're going to be listening to Joan Woodard, who's Vice President for Nuclear Programs at Sandia National Laboratories. And we have equally distinguished speakers coming for the rest of the semester. So once again, I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for turning out. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Bill Spencer, my collaborator and co-criminal in this enterprise, who is going to give a brief introduction to Chuck Geschke.
Thank you, Ken. For those that don't know, that was Professor Flam, a distinguished economist and specialist in semiconductors and computers. Let me add my welcome to you. Also, to remind the class that you have a assignment due before midnight on Friday. I would ask you to stay tuned in case we make some changes. You may want to be aware of those as they occur in real time. So remind you of that. Everybody met that 2 weeks ago, and I assume you'll do the same fine work this time. As Ken pointed out, I'm Bill Spencer. I'm a visiting professor, I think. I've not been able to get all of the paperwork and other things completely done, so I sometimes wonder what my status is. It's a real pleasure for me this evening to welcome Chuck. It's hard for me to think of him as distinguished from the time we spent together at Park more than 25 years ago. But it's double pleasure tonight because the other half of the Geschke team is here, and I'm going to ask Nancy Geschke in the back to stand up. So if you don't get an answer from Chuck, Nan will be here, and she can give you the other side of the story. It was just 26 years ago that Chuck and John Warnock left Xerox Park and formed Adobe. And Adobe, by any measure, has to be deemed a huge success. It's now over $3 billion in sales and has a very impressive financial sheet. If you want to be impressed, look at it. They beat the street again just recently in their announcements. As we heard last year from TSMC, they had done in the first half of this year, even though the semiconductor industry slowed, and in an economy like this, to be ahead of what the street expects is quite impressive. Chuck is on several boards. The ones that I'm aware of is a symphony board where we attend the symphony together once in a while in San Francisco. He's also on the Commonwealth board, which is a really a very good group in San Francisco that brings in speakers from all over the world on especially important topics. As I pointed out, I met Chuck 28 years ago, probably, when I came to Park prior to funding Adobe Systems. He was a researcher in the computer science lab for a while, and then formed imaging sciences lab for a variety of reasons, and did some very good work. He and John made some important developments, and for that they've been recognized widely. Chuck is a member of the National Academy of Engineering since 1995, and a number of other awards that are too numerous for me to mention. Chuck holds a PhD from Carnegie-Mellon in computer science, which has to be one of the top computers, or maybe the top computer science department in the world. and before that, a bachelor's degree in mathematics and Latin, both from Xavier University. So with that, let me turn the mic over to good friend and associate Chuck Geschke.
Well, good evening, and let me also thank all of you for being here, although I suspect the students feel they don't have a choice. They have to show up. Thank you, Bill, for the very kind introduction. As Bill said, we've known one another for a long time. We also spent a lot of time underneath the basket in the Xerox Basketball League, and I can testify that Bill has very sharp elbows. It was always sobering for me. I want to talk to you tonight about several things and put them in the context of my experience in starting a Silicon Valley company, and talk to you about not only the globalization and the entrepreneurship as well as the innovation required to make such a company successful, but also about some of the philosophies of what you do to build a business and make sure that in the light of competition and other issues that you will obviously confront in running that business, how you keep your customers loyal to you and how you use your customers to help fend off your competition. Because I'm using Adobe, you might get the feeling that this is somehow intended to be a commercial for the company. I don't intend it that way, but it's the framework that I know the best and where my experience is based, and so I'm going to use it to try and talk about all of those issues. One of the advantages of age, if you have any memory left, and Bill and I have been talking for the last many hours about how little of our memory still survives, you remember a lot of things. A few things that you did well, a lot more things that you didn't do so well, and one of the advantages of being in that position is I can share some of those things with you in the hopes that someday they'll be of use to you as you get involved in any kind of organization. It could be a business, it could be an educational institution, it could be in the healthcare system. It doesn't matter what it is. Whenever you're working in a medium to large organization, you're going to run into a set of issues that hopefully some of my experience and the experience of other people who come here to talk to you can help you get through them. So I'm going to focus on 5 things. I'm going to first talk about the steps that I went through to start up a company. You could say that's sort of how does a blue-collar kid from Cleveland, Ohio ever get to start a high-tech company in Silicon Valley. Secondly, what it meant to start a successful company, because as you may be aware, significantly less than 5% of these startups ever actually get to the point of lasting 5, 10, in our case 25 years as a corporation. Number 3, I'm going to talk about what you need to do when you encounter the difficult times. It's easy to run a company when everything is going well. It takes a lot of focus, energy, and investment in the process of building your company to survive the difficult times. Then I'm also going to be, especially because of the theme of this course, talk a little bit about what we did to globalize our company over its 25-year history. And finally, I'll talk about a few things that still keep me up at night related to business, not all the other things that might keep me up, and a little bit about what the success of a business really means to somebody. As I find today, people mostly talk about the financial success, and they don't talk about all the other aspects of success that you will find as you go through life really become much more important to you. Both Nan and I were born in Cleveland, Ohio. By the time I got ready to go to high school, it was the first time my parents gave me some freedom to make a decision. They wanted me to go to a very safe and secure parochial high school on the suburban part of Cleveland. I said, no, I want to go to that school down in the center of the city in a tough neighborhood run by the Jesuits. That's where I went to school. The Jesuits had such a profound effect on me that I tell willingly anybody that those 4 years at St. Ignatius High School probably did more to form me both intellectually and in every other respect than any other educational institution. So much so that I decided I wanted to become a Jesuit. So I entered the seminary. Well, after 3 years, both the Jesuits and I made a good decision, and I moved on. Ended up at Xavier University, and the reason my undergraduate major is in mathematics, or excuse me, it's not mathematics, it's in Latin, is that I had taken so many classics courses before, that was the most efficient way to get out of school. But at the same time, I took as many math classes as I could, and I got my master's degree a year after my bachelor's and began teaching at a liberal arts school in Cleveland called John Carroll University, and I was going to Case at the same time to get my PhD in mathematics. After I was teaching for a few years, we had a faculty meeting and decided that one of our master's students just wasn't cutting it, and someone had to tell him to leave. We drew straws, and because I'm telling you this story, you can guess who got the short straw. So I called him into my office. It's the first time I ever did anything the equivalent of firing someone. I tried not to defeat his ego. I told him he had lots of skills and capabilities. It just wasn't going to be in mathematics. He was disappointed. He left. And a year later, he called me. And he said, I'd like to come talk to you. I said, well, fine. And all the time in the back of my mind, I'm saying, well, this could be a very difficult meeting. He came into my office, big smile on his face. Best thing you ever did is kick me out of here, Mr. Geschke. I said, well, why? And he said, I got this job selling computers for General Electric, and I've made so much money the first year, I just had to come and thank you. It was the best thing anyone ever did for me. And he said, I've been trying to think how I could show you my gratitude, and it occurred to me that I could teach you how to program if you would be interested. I said, well, great. So this kid I had kicked out of school 1 year later came by in the evenings all through the summer and taught me how to program. Well, Nan immediately noticed that I was having a lot more fun playing around with that computer than thinking about differential equations on Banach spaces. Oh, I forgot to give the standard commercial about turning off your cell phones. Learned a lot more, or was a lot more interested in that computer than that very esoteric topic, and don't ever ask me to come back and talk about differential equations in Banach spaces. So we decided to take a risk. I rode away to Carnegie-Mellon, got a scholarship there, and off we went to graduate school with 2 kids and another soon to follow. So here I want to take a slight detour. I said I got a scholarship. In fact, what I got was a grant from ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. Today they put defense in front of the name and call it DARPA. ARPA today, or DARPA today, is nothing like the ARPA back in the late 60s. And the way ARPA began was that when Eisenhower was turning over the government to Kennedy, he had been advised by his defense consultants that the U.S. military needed to move out of the realm of analog communications and move into digital communications in order to maintain a secure worldwide military force. Now, I suspect in that conversation neither participant exactly knew what they were talking about, but Kennedy respected Eisenhower's judgment, and if that was important, he was going to do something about it. So he took McNamara aside, who was probably his most technical manager in the original cabinet, plus he had the largest budget. And what Kennedy wanted to do was start this program without spending a lot of time talking to Congress about it. And he said, McNamara, you have enough money. I want you to take enough to have an impact, but small enough that Congress doesn't give us any hassle about it. And he said, in addition to that, I mostly want you to use the money to find a way to educate a young cadre of people who are experts in the field of computing and electronics, but you have to do a little research too in case Congress ever calls us to task. Well, McNamara didn't know how to do any of that either, so he in turn knew a fella at MIT called J.C.R. Licklider. And Licklider was hanging out in the computational labs at MIT where they were focusing more on computers to communicate than to calculate. If you, well, most of you who are students here are way too young to remember this, but I see a few gray hairs in the crowd. Those of us remember that back in the days of the late 60s, IBM would put commercials in print and on television about how many multiplies they could do in a millisecond or a microsecond. I guess not a microsecond in those days, maybe in a second. Whatever it was all calculation. That's what everybody thought computers would be used for. But what Licklider saw was the opportunity to marry communications, which was the objective of this program, and computing by finding the people across the United States who did that. And so he ended up selecting about a dozen universities where some of the best research was going on. There were places like Caltech, UCLA, Stanford, Berkeley, Utah, Illinois, Michigan, Harvard, MIT, obviously, and a couple of others that I'm probably not going to rattle off, including, of course, Carnegie-Mellon, or at those days, Carnegie Tech. And what he did is gave each one of those schools a couple $1 million. That was a lot of money, by the way, back in those days. And each school was told, do great computer science, but mostly educate students. And Licklider had a policy that he said he would not micromanage them. He would come by, or one of his people who worked with him would come by a couple times a year, make sure everything was going well, trying to understand whether they were making the right kind of progress, give them a little feedback, and then wait another 6 months and come back again. And rely upon the integrity of the principal investigators, the people who had the actual contract, to do the right things in terms of education and in research. If you go through the lineage of Silicon Valley, every one of the major engineering people, business managers, a lot of the founders of companies there were all ARPA brats. We were all educated by the U.S. government during the 60s and 70s. It was an incredible investment, not very much money, and it put the United States in a leadership position in that area. And when I come back to talk about what I worry about, I'll come back to that point. I thought the climate here was humid. It seems very dry. So, I got my PhD. Nan and I went off on a quick interviewing trip to several places, and a couple of my friends from Carnegie-Mellon, had left there and gone to work for a brand new research lab being started in Palo Alto called the Xerox Research Center. Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and that's how it got the acronym PARC. I went out there. I liked what I saw. I liked the peoples. As I said, a few of my friends were already there. So I took a job and began doing research in the area of computer science. My graduate degree and expertise was in the area of optimizing compilers, something that's become less and less important as memory and speeds of machines have increased so much. But at the time, it was a reasonably important field. By 1976, in my office, I had a personal computer called the Alto. Its display was not horizontal like a television set, but vertical, because that's the way a sheet of paper was oriented. It was a bitmap display. On that computer, we had a text editing program called Bravo, which was the precursor of Word. And in fact, the young guy who did it, Strauss Centers, left PARC eventually, went to Microsoft and developed Office for them. In addition to that, there were graphics program, a mail program, probably better than any mail program you use today. It was all hooked up on the Ethernet, which was also developed at Xerox PARC. And that Ethernet was connected to a 60-page-a-minute black and white printer, a 10-page-a-minute color printer, a file system, and in turn was on the ARPANET, which was the precursor of the Internet, and it communicated with roughly 1,000 machines around Xerox Corporation. This is 5 years before the IBM PC is introduced to the market. In 1977, I and two other people at PARC were given the responsibility to put on a one-day event for Xerox senior management down in Boca Raton, Florida. Xerox would hold these events every 2, 3, 4 years. They were mostly business, but also partly social, so everybody brought their wife or their girlfriend with them. And we put on a one-day show in the morning on stage, showing what the office of the future could look like, and then in the afternoon ran what today you would call a trade show, where people could walk around, touch the equipment, use it, see how it would be employed. I believe all 250 executives from Xerox were men. There may have been a woman somewhere, but I don't think I ever met her. This was the body language of each Xerox executive. Now, any of you who have either been in sales or if you ever get into sales, this is not positive body language when someone is trying to be told about something. The wives and girlfriends, on the other hand, had all worked in offices, and they loved this stuff. They played with the mouse, they'd click a button, it printed out on the printer the same way it looked on the screen. They said, wow, this is really cool. Well, in the back of my mind, as a result of that experience in 1977, I began to realize the challenge we as researchers were facing. We had built something that we knew was really cool, extremely state-of-the-art, very innovative, with huge potential, and our biggest problem was convincing the people who paid us to develop it that it was worth something. We kept trying. As Bill indicated, I was given a chance to start a new laboratory focused in the area of printing and graphics. I had to hire a chief scientist, and I made the best hiring decision of my life. I hired my partner, John Warnock, who at the time was working for Evans and Sutherland, but out in Silicon Valley. John and I began working on a project to design a protocol, a language that computers and application software running on those computers could use to talk to a printer to produce the kind of print you saw coming out of a printing press. All of the beautiful typography, the line art, as well as the graphics, pictorial pictures, everything. And we did that project. It was called Interpress. We showed it to Xerox senior management. They said, this is incredible. This is exactly what we needed. We will adopt it as a Xerox standard for interfacing between computers and printers. I said, well, boy, that's great. In our laboratory, we're only in business like a couple of years. We have this great success. I got on an airplane. I went back to Xerox headquarters in Connecticut, and I said, when can we give me a marketing person so we can start talking about this? And they said, oh, wait a minute. We're at Xerox Corporation. At Xerox, it takes 7 years to bring out a product. So you can't talk about this to anybody until we're close to the time of introducing the products that embodied it. I said, 7 years. In the computer industry, that's 2 to 3 generations of technology. It'll be such old news by the time we bring it to market, it won't be worth anything. Sorry, Xerox, 7 years. Well, I came back and I talked to John, and he and I got rather depressed and frustrated, and we decided we had to do something about it. So through his thesis advisor, a fellow by the name of Dave Evans from the University of Utah, we were introduced to Bill Hambrick of Hambrick and Quist. And Bill was one of the first venture guys in high technology out in the San Francisco Bay Area. John and I had put together a proposal for what we wanted to be a business plan. And one of the first questions Bill asked us is, well, have you guys ever run a business before? Oh, well, no, not exactly. I said I ran a lab. John had been involved in a couple of startups back on the East Coast, actually. And we didn't really have any formal business training. In fact, when John and I decided we were going to leave Xerox, we went off to a bookstore and bought one book on business. I only remember one chapter in that book, and the chapter was called Market Gap Analysis. Now, it's a very simple concept. And it said that if you want to start a new business, look for a gap in the marketplace, a place where no one is already entrenched with a solution to a problem that people are willing to pay money to solve, and develop your product, in our case, your technology, to go after that. And we looked at one another and said, well, that makes sense. What could be so hard about that? And so that's been always our philosophy. We always innovate. We always look for gaps in the market. And I'll come back and talk about the effect of that in a little bit. Nonetheless, Bill, being practical, hired someone to help us write the business plan because he said, I need to have that to go off to my investors and partners and raise the money for you. Well, we did that. He got the business plan, says it looks good to me. We raised a commitment from Hambrick and Quist of $2.5 million over a 2-year period to be paid in 2 equal payments. John and I went off and leased a VAX computer. We opened our office, and we were in business. So we were in business for about 4 or 5 weeks. A professor of mine from Carnegie-Mellon, Gordon Bell, who had since left Carnegie and become the head of research and development for digital equipment, came by to visit. He wanted to see what we were doing. He had heard we'd left Park. And we showed him what our plans were, talked to him about our business plan. By then, I think we already had a very early sample of what our expectations were of what we can do. And he said, boy, that looks great. He said, but because our plan involved, and I forgot to mention what it was, I guess you would like to know that. It was to build a set of computers, workstations, laser printers, laser typesetting equipment, and all the software to make all of that work together and sell it as a complete package into the Fortune 500 as a solution for bringing all of their printing and publishing in-house. One of the major costs in most major businesses. So that was the business plan. Well, we told Gordon what the business plan, and he said, well, I don't need the computers, I'm digital equipment. And I've already got a deal with Ricoh in Japan for the laser printer. My problem is I've got 3 or 4 development teams trying to build the software that interfaces between them, and they're getting nowhere. So why don't you sell me the software? And we said, well, Gordon, we have this business plan. It raised $2.5 million. That's what we're going to have to do, so sorry, we can't sell you just the software. And he said, well, if you change your mind, give me a call. About 2 or 3 months later, Steve Jobs comes by with a friend of ours who had also left Park and who was running the hardware development for the Macintosh. And we showed Steve what was doing. We talked to him about our business plan, and he said, well, I don't need a computer. And he had the Macintosh with him, and he showed us the Macintosh. He said, this is going to come out next year. And I've got a deal with Canon for laser printers, so I don't need a laser printer. But if I got a development team trying to make the computer and the printer do what they need to do, and they're failing miserably, and I don't know where I'm going to go, why don't you sell me your company? Well, we said, well, Steve, we're going to want to run our own business. And he said, all right. He said, well, then why don't you sell me the software? And we said, well, Steve, we have this business plan. It raised $2.5 million, and that's what we got to do. And he said, oh, you're nuts, but call me if you ever change your mind. So we went back and talked to the gentleman who had been put in as the chairman of our board by Hambrick and Quist as sort of a senior advisor to help us. And we described these 2 meetings to him, and he said, they're both right, you're nuts. He said, that business plan is worthless. It was only there to get you the money. Now what you've learned is what customers really want. You know you can provide it. That should be your product. So we said, okay. So I called Steve back up, and he said, well, how much do you want for the company? I said, Steve, it's not for sale. He said, fine, well, we'll do a deal. And so Apple signed a deal with us at the end of our first year in being in business with a prepayment of future royalties for developing the software and the hardware, actually, for the Apple Laser Writer, the original one. And in addition to that, they took a 20% interest in the company at 5x the multiple of the original investors. So we went from a $2.5 million company to a $12.5 in 1 year. This never happens in Silicon Valley. And we were profitable at the end of that first year because of the prepayment of future royalties. So we finished, we did the Laser Writer. It rolled out to great critical acclaim, sold really well for about 3 or 4 months, and then it began to taper off. And of course, we started to get really nervous. And we went and talked to Apple, and well, it turned out that Apple at the time was positioning the Macintosh, along with this printer, which cost more than the Macintosh, by the way, as the the Macintosh Office. And they were going head up against IBM. They didn't have any direct sales force. They had no entree into the major Fortune 500. And so they were failing miserably. Well, fortunately, there was a marketing guy at Apple and ourselves and a company up in Seattle called Aldus. And we all got together and began to speculate about what we could do with Aldus's software, which laid out pages, the Laser Writer, and the Macintosh to go into the publishing business. And that's where the concept of desktop publishing was born. Apple, we, and Aldus put anybody who could put on a tie or put on a dress and go out and talk about publishing to seed the market with all of the, primarily the industry analysts, not the financial analysts. And all of a sudden, the complete system turned around for Apple. They became incredibly successful. A micro industry was built around desktop publishing. So we found ourselves with a product launch and a revenue base that started to grow very rapidly. We went from 4 million to 16 to 39 to 83 million to 129 million in the first 5 years. It was a rocket ship. We went public in August of 1986, which was just a little over 4 years from being in business. And you're going to laugh at this. The public offering was for $5.5 million, which made our post-offering cap $55 million. And today we're a $20 billion to 25, depending on the market cap, bigger than Ford, GM, and Xerox, of all things. Great success story. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in business, something will always go wrong. You just don't know what it is and when it is. And in fact, a generic piece of advice that you've probably heard from other people is the time to be most scared is when things are going really well, because you got to be doing something to figure out what's going to go wrong and get ready for it. I wish our U.S. government would have done that as well. So 1989 arrived, and we got the first major dose of reality, what it's really like out in a very cutthroat, very competitive business market. It turns out that we had decided to develop some technology to make the topography on the screen of the computer, which is much lower resolution than the printer, look as good on the screen as it could possibly be, and not be these little jagged bitmap characters, so that people, when they looked at the display version of their document, had a pretty good feeling for what it would look like on the printer. Well, it turns out at the same time, Apple was trying to do that on their own with a technology that they codenamed TrueType. But they were struggling. They didn't have the license agreements with the type vendors. The technology was having difficulty getting off the ground. So we began to work on it, talked to Apple about it. Of course, they kept pushing us off because they were getting tired of paying us royalties for printing, let alone for anything that ran in their operating system. And so we went to Microsoft, and we showed them the technology, and we had developed it under Windows as well. And they looked at it, and they said, well, that looks really good. And so we were encouraged, and I sent our sales guys off. I said, get to work on this, get a contract done with Microsoft. That'll push Apple to perhaps change their mind. Well, we couldn't get the deal done, and we couldn't get the deal done. And finally, our sales guy said, Chuck, you got to call up Gates and find out what the problem is. Well, it turns out the problem was that Microsoft viewed us as a potential competitor in the future, and there was nothing they would do to help us. So in fact, and rather than working with us, they went off and made a deal with Apple that would put TrueType on Windows, and it turned out Microsoft had a clone developer of PostScript, which was our technology for printing, and they would license that to Apple. So basically, our biggest competitor and our biggest customer got together, formed an alliance to put us out of business. Now that's what you call bad news. That's a bad day. Well, it happened, therefore, that we really had to pull back and think a little bit about how to deal with this. The first thing you do is you go back and you sort of look at, and I know this phrase is used a lot and has lots of coded meanings, but I don't have a better phrase, so I'm going to use it. You have to look at sort of your core values of your company, the core principles that made you go into business and kept you in business and built the sort of personality and the style of your company. And the first principle that John and I had when we started the company is that we wanted to build a company that we personally would be like to work at. Because we figured if we built that kind of a company, it would be a lot easier to recruit really high quality employees and to retain them. And hopefully our customers would sense that, and our customers would like to deal with us as well. Second thing we had to focus on very carefully now that this competitive threat was raised is that we're a company built purely on intellectual capital. All of our capital resources get in automobiles, on buses, and on trains and leave every day. And if you don't make an environment that's exciting enough, energetic enough, financially rewarding enough, they might not come back the next day. And so you really need to focus on making sure that you develop all of the processes necessary to make that apparent to your employees that this is really the best place they can possibly work. One of the other principles we had is that you always hire the best person you could find for a job. And typically always hire somebody who's smarter than you, because that's a much bigger population than the alternative. Think about that for just a second. And as a result, we were able to hire some brilliant people and have been able to hire them over the years. Many of the very best of them have worked at the company basically the entire time it's been in business. The fourth thing we knew about our business is that we could only survive and succeed and thrive if we focused on innovation. Our whole industry is about innovation and change, and if you don't like change and you don't like innovation and you're terrified about it, you cannot be successful either as the founder or manager or employee of a high-tech company in our industry. And we have always built products that defined new markets, whether it was PostScript or Illustrator or Photoshop or Acrobat, and got into the marketplace when, by definition, we had 100% market share because it was a brand new market. The fifth thing, when you're running a business, you have at least 4 constituencies that you're dealing with. You're dealing with your shareholders, you're dealing with your customers, you're dealing with your employees, and you're dealing with the communities in which you operate. And how well you run that company is determined by how well you balance the needs and desires of each of those 4 constituencies, because they're all mildly in conflict with one another. Because what's really good for one of them may not be so bad for, or not so good for another constituency. This is something I've always remembered. I was talking to an investor who owned a fair amount of Adobe stock, and we were making a presentation. This is before the Reg FD days when you could actually talk to investors, and I told him about our business and what we were doing, what our financial models look like, and he said, yeah, that all sounds good. He says, but you know, you got a big problem, Geschke. I said, well, I'm sure I have several. Which one are you referring to? And he says, you treat your employees too well. And I always thought that was so bizarre, because he wanted us to bring more profit to the bottom line but shortchange our employees with both options and salary. Well, that would have put those constituencies, those 2, out of balance. And that would have meant that our company would not have succeeded in the long run. And finally, when John and I started the company, we had a great set of role models in Silicon Valley, David Packard and Bill Hewlett. And you've all read, I'm sure, about the HP way and some of the philosophy that Dave and Bill had. And I won't tell you that John and I have 100% conformity and agreement with with the HP way, but we did in effect install an Adobe way without even thinking about codenaming it with those words. And the philosophy was very simple. We didn't have a lot of rules and handbooks and other things to read. If you're dealing with one of those constituencies I just talked about, a customer or a vendor or a member of the community in which we're operating or a fellow employee, how do you treat them? Very simple. You treat them the way you'd like to be treated. And if you do that, you will retain a great relationship with that person or that entity. And that has always been the Adobe way. Now, you could listen to that entire sort of homily and assume that I'm up here as a corporate preacher. The question is it preaching or is it good business? Well, I think I have some very good first-hand evidence that it's not just preaching, that it really is good business. So how did we respond to this thing? Well, it turned out that it happened at a conference in San Francisco, which was a major conference in the printing and publishing industry called the Siebold Conference. It occurred once a year in September. And it was at that conference, in fact, that Bill Gates got up and talked about doing the deal with Apple. And by that time, Steve Jobs had left, and he was actually also up on the keynote, as was my partner. Well, John had a famous quote about after Gates spoke first, he spoke next, and he said, I've never heard of so much garbage mumbo-jumbo in my life, because he was frustrated with the fact that Microsoft was trying to steal our business. And then Jobs got up and gave us an endorsement, because at that time he was running Next, which was his business after Apple. At any rate, halfway through the conference, actually closer to the end, the organizers of the conference decided to have a panel. And the panel topic of conversation was, should we stick with Adobe and their technology, or should we go with the Apple and Microsoft consortium? And they decided to have a panel discussion, and they had 4 analysts up on the stage to talk about it. And before the moderator began, he said, I think I'd like to start by taking a straw vote. He said, I would like everyone who wants Apple and Microsoft to succeed in taking the market away and replacing Adobe's technology to please raise your hand. Now, this is a room with about 1,500 people in it, because it's a very large conference. And I will acknowledge a couple dozen hands went up. My personal belief is they were all Apple and Microsoft employees. But by far, the dominant position of everybody sitting there, who were our customers, in some cases our competitors even, and they saw that by taking down our technology, they in fact would be ceding the market to someone that wouldn't have the ability to innovate the way we did. And history has sort of confirmed that as well. The lesson I took away from that is that all those things that we did, the innovation, and by the way, we produced an aftermarket product to go on Windows and Apple within 3 months of that conference, sold hundreds of thousands of units in the first quarter, and it took them 3 years to bring out the answer, which turned out to be irrelevant by that time. So we did the innovation thing that we always committed to as a company. It energized the people in our business to show that they could be competitive. And finally, we never lost a single customer to the Apple and Microsoft deal. I'm going to move along, so I'm not going to talk about the second example other than to briefly say it happened about 7 years later. We got into trouble with trying to reorganize the company and hire replacements for John and myself. It turned out that the Japanese marketplace just fell off a cliff. Our revenue went down. Our spending had gotten ahead of our revenue. We had to report a bad quarter, and one of our competitors in one product area tried to do a hostile takeover on us. Happened at the SIBO conference, same kind of deal. Another panel, another question. This time nobody raised their hand because nobody liked the way this company dealt with them as customers. And in fact, once again, the Adobe way and the Adobe relationship really did pay off in a business sense, not just in the sense of someone up there preaching about our philosophy. So I want to switch gears now. I want to talk a little bit about what our experience was in internationalizing or making global. We didn't talk so much about globalization in those days, our business. Because in fact, we started from the very beginning. One of the first things we needed to do, because we were going into the printing business, was to get a license agreement with the vendors who made typefaces. These are the little blocks of lead that printers used to put in plates in order to print. Well, we were going to digitize them and make them part of our solution. And in the industry of printing and publishing and advertising, and it's very important to the people who design those products, those printed products, that they have control and trade names associated with those typefaces. They've learned to design with them. That's what they want to expect to see. And we couldn't avoid getting those licenses, but they were very hard to get. They had never been licensed to anybody outside of the owners. So the first company we went to was a US company because we thought, well, that'll be easier, right? So we went to CompuGraphic, which was based back in Massachusetts, which at the time had the lion's share of the US market for typesetting equipment. And they had produced a family of typefaces, excuse me, that were sort of second tier, but they had become acceptable in the US market. And we said we wanted to do a deal to license them and use them inside of our products. They wouldn't talk to us. we're not interested. What you guys are doing is sort of irrelevant. We're going to solve this problem better than you guys ever could. And that's because they had a business philosophy, which was very common in the printing and publishing industry, that you got locked into a silo. If you were a CompuGraphic customer, you couldn't exchange any equipment from any other manufacturer. You were totally captive. And the same would be true if you went to a Japanese company like Nippon, or if you went to Linotype in Germany, or Agfa-Gevaert in Belgium. You were locked in. So they didn't want to have anybody who was doing what we were doing, which was making compatible equipment from a variety of vendors. So when they refused, we went over to Germany to talk to Linotype, which was actually the premier type library, the very original one that first had Times Roman and Helvetica and all the typefaces that were premier in the printing and publishing industry. And at first they didn't want to talk to us, but we finally found a guy who was an engineering manager there who recognized that they were losing market share because they weren't innovating fast enough, that their silo was getting smaller while CompuGraphics and some other companies were getting bigger. And so he decided that the way to do this was to break the mold and do business with us. So in fact, we were able to, in 1983, to negotiate a deal with Linotype to be the first company ever to get access to their entire type library. We would pay them royalties for using those typefaces, and we would digitize them and put them on all PostScript printers. By 1985, we recognized that we also needed to start doing business with the Japanese because they were the primary laser printer manufacturers, and we couldn't ignore them. And so we began talking to, first of all, two typeface vendors there. There were two. The premier one was a company called Shaken in Tokyo, and the secondary one was Murasawa in Osaka. Now, what was interesting is that the people who were the founders of those two companies originally were partners and had the business in Tokyo under a different name before World War II. And as Japan got more and more military and more focused on going to war, they had a falling out. And the one fella, Shaken, stayed in Tokyo because he was supportive of the war effort, and Murasawa went to Osaka and took the business in that district because he was not supportive of the war. So after the war, of course, Shaken recovered much more quickly because a lot more investment was made in Tokyo, and so Murasawa was sort of a second-tier company. So I went with one of our type designer guys, and we went and met the folks at Shaken, which, very unusual for a Japanese company, was now run by the widow of the founder. He had died, and so she was running the company. I never could get to the second cup of tea with her. You know, very polite, say hello, sorry, we're not interested. Tried 2 or 3 times, tried through side doors and other things, couldn't get anywhere. So the next trip, we went to Osaka to talk to Murasawa. And this time I took not only the type guy, but I took our best salesman. And our best salesman explained to Murasawa how we would eventually succeed, and if we did, their typefaces could be in millions of products being sold in Japan and throughout the world, whereas Shaken would be cut off from that market. And it's interesting, they listened, and they were basically real entrepreneurial kind of people, and they said, okay, we will license you our type library. So that put us into business in Japan, and what was critical about that is that we couldn't do domestic business with the likes of Ricoh and Canon and Fujitsu and all of the other Japanese manufacturers unless we helped them get into the domestic market in Japan as well. That was sort of the quid pro quo. So we made a Japanese version of our printing technology with Murasawa's typefaces, and we began to do business in Japan. And that same sales guy, Steve McDonald, who did such a good job of convincing Murasawa, pulled off the sort of coup of his sales career. He got 2 companies who didn't like one another, NEC and Fujitsu, to announce on the same day that they were both doing business with Adobe and putting out products. Because if one of them went first, the other one would never have done it. And it was a real, and it began to teach me about the importance of culture and understanding how business is done in different environments. After all, I'd grown up my entire life in the United States. I'd had the privilege to do a little bit of traveling internationally, but never in Asia. And when you go into Japan, it's quite a different world in terms of doing business, in terms of the marketplace. I remember when we launched Illustrator there, we put up a beautiful poster of a face, a Japanese face that was colored white. Somebody immediately tore it down and they said, "That's the mask of death. You can't have that up in your booth." So just a trivial example of what little we knew in terms of doing that. We also launched Illustrator simultaneously in Europe, in Munich, Paris, and England. And for them, it was interesting to me to see the difference in the culture. When we launched in Germany, all the questions from the people that we talked to in the formal announcement show asked about the nuts and bolts of how our technology worked. How many bytes does it take to do this, and how fast can you do that, and all of this kind of stuff. Very engineering oriented. We showed up in Paris, and we were on the 12e etage of the Eiffel Tower, the second floor. We had a conference room there, and we walked into the room, and all they had at that point was the beta version of the product. And here a whole cadre of French graphic artists had done printouts of designs that they had done, and they had them hanging all over the walls. They just loved it because it was art, and it was so cool. And they just fell in love with the technology and the product. Then we went to England, had the same kind of event, and all they asked for is, what will you charge us, what kind of discount rate can we get as a distributor, and how quickly can we get the product into market. So it really tells you the difference between the cultures. And the last sort of anecdotal thing is that as we began to introduce our technologies into Japan and build stronger and stronger relationships there, they of course push you very hard to do all of the socializing that they like to do as part of business. And I can't tell you how many times I ate meals in which, first of all, I didn't know what I was eating, but it often was still moving as I went to consume it. But they're testing, you know, the gaijin. They want to know if the foreigners can do this. And so I did it, but sometimes it was a little difficult. So as a result of these early entrees into internationalization, we now have offices, primarily sales and customer relationship building offices, in 36 countries. We do research and development here in the United States. Our headquarters are in San Jose, California, but we also have a major office from an acquisition we did of Macromedia in San Francisco, a major facility in Seattle as a result of our Aldus acquisition, development team in Boston, in San Diego, here in Austin, and in Minnesota. So we do development all across the United States. When you hire talented people, you want to make sure they're living where they want to live. And with modern technology, co-location is often not all that important. And so you have to be able to deal with that. But in addition to the development offices I just mentioned here in the United States, we have over 1,000 employees in India in 2 locations, in Delhi and in Bangalore. And those employees are not call center employees. They're masters and PhDs in computer science, doing very interesting work, often handling, because of the cost difference, products that are sort of longer in the tooth and getting closer to end of life. But they also do some brand new innovation, both within specific products as well as individual new products as well. We now have a development team in Beijing. We have one in Norwich, England. We have 2 in Germany, one in Munich and the other up in Hamburg. We just opened an office in Romania because there are some talented young people that we found there that had some technology we wanted to acquire, and they didn't want to move to the United States. We said, fine, stay where you are and grow and prosper. And finally, of course, we have in Japan. If you were to walk into our headquarters facilities in San Jose, California, you might for just a microsecond think that maybe you had walked into the United Nations. Because what you see there, because of our principle of hiring the best, is people from all over the world. A lot like the class that Bill has gathered here in Austin. And that heterogeneity has really made our company so much stronger because of the ability to sort of focus on a global, worldwide basis. People who work there have experience either because they were educated outside the United States, born and raised outside the United States, or even if they were born here, have relationships with those environments, understand those cultures, and help us make our business successful in that part of the world. So what keeps me up at night, which is the last thing I want to talk about, or second last thing. Well, one of the ones that's really troubling me is the loss of our competitive position in this country in terms of technology, engineering, and the investments that we're making in our future from the point of view of basic research. We are falling behind at an incredibly rapid rate. There are fewer PhDs being produced in computer science today than when I got my degree. It's crazy. And the ones who are graduating often are coming from outside the United States, extremely talented people, and then because of some of the policies of our government, we're not inviting them or making it easy for them to stay, and so they go back home, which is a real loss to our country, because it's the talents of those people who have made us so strong. I have some data that I picked up a couple of years ago, and I apologize for the fact it's out of date, but maybe Dr. Spencer will give you a project to bring more of this information up to date, because I would like to have it refreshed. I tried to do a little work on the web, but I didn't have enough time to do it very well. So this data, as I said, is probably a couple years out of date. First of all, China and South Korea have increased government spending on research by 10% or more annually. That's from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 2004, by the way, here in this country, it's flat to slightly down. In 2004, 38% of the nation's scientists and engineers with doctorates were born outside this country, 38%. And of the PhDs in science and engineering that were awarded to foreign students between 1985 and 2000, more than half went to students from China, India, South Korea, and Taiwan. And many of those, as I said, now are being, in effect, asked to go back home. So if we want to be successful in this very competitive, globalized world, we have to have a large share of the best world scientists, and that's crucial to our ability to innovate. And that policy has to change. There was a recent survey by Booz Allen Hamilton in 2006 that said that China and India will account for 39% of the world's R&D personnel by the end of 2007. 39%. And that's up from 19% in the middle of this decade. Huge growth. In global R&D rankings, the United States leads. Sounds good. We have 34% of the total, and half of all such spending comes from two countries, the United States and Japan. Sounds good. But that's probably not the most meaningful measure. Some data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development points out that the U.S. actually ranks 7th in R&D spending as a share or proportion of the economy. And we trail Sweden, Finland, Japan, Switzerland, this one always gets me, Iceland, and South Korea in terms of that spending. Not a very good report card. If you go to basic research, take most of the D out of R&D, we rank 11th by that metric. And if you take out defense research, we rank 22nd. No longer a world power when it comes to the investment in research and the improvement and generation of new technology. And I will tell you, business today is not picking up the slack. Most of the R&D in business is D. There's a little bit of R. IBM Research Labs are a shadow of their past. Bell Labs is mostly gone. Xerox PARC is a shadow of its former self. Those places don't exist anymore. Yeah, a very specialized company like Intel is doing some very innovative work, but it's very specialized. And it really is more focused on promoting Intel's business than generating new markets and new opportunities. And I hope I'm not being too unfair to Intel by saying that. Imagine what we could do if we had an ARPA like the old ARPA that was investing in energy independence, better bioengineering. Imagine what could be done if we educated people well enough to be able to do that kind of work, and if we invested in that as opposed to investing in some of the things we're investing in today. That bothers me a lot. Not for me, obviously, I'm too old. Not that much for my children, because they're already almost in their 40s, all of them. They'll probably do fine. But my grandchildren, they're going to see a very different world. The other thing that keeps me up at night, as it would with anybody in the high-tech industry, is what two guys or gals are doing in a garage somewhere, people I've never heard of. You know, when's the next Google going to come along that decides to take Adobe's market and sort of replace it with something brand new that we've never thought of? Always a risk, always a chance. And the company Bill and I work for, Xerox, experienced that with people who left to start 3Com and Adobe and several other companies. The very final thing, and this is a little more personal. What does someone like myself or my partner John, who are engineers, really value from the experience of starting a company like Adobe? Well, first of all, you have to understand engineers. We're a sort of different kind of breed. Nan can tell you in great detail how different we are. But we think about things a little differently than a lot of people. When we think about millions, we think about millions of people using something that we've invented. Yeah, obviously we're not going to throw away the money and the stock options and all of that came with it. But an engineer's dream is to build a solution to someone's problem and find millions of people who want to buy it. And I can't tell you how many times people who would have no reason to know who I am accidentally find out that I founded Adobe, and they'll just stick their hand out and say, you know, you made a real difference in my life. Your products allowed, you know, myself to build a business, or my wife to go off and realize her dream in design. Whatever it is, that you made a difference. And that is the second thing that's most rewarding. And the last one is very personal to me. It turns out that my father and my grandfather were both letterpress photo engravers. Those are the people who made the original plates for four-color printing that were used to do all of the printing in the world up until we all made it electronic, which is sort of what Adobe did. And I can remember visiting my dad at work back in the 50s, and he was working around benzenes, etching baths, cyanide, all sorts of terrible stuff, and had ink on his hands all of his life until he retired. And he would be producing these plates, and he'd be modifying the plate by using a stone to rub it a little bit to change the halftone and do all of this incredible work. And so when he heard what we were doing and starting our business, it obviously caught his imagination. And so we finally got to the point that we were doing some reasonably decent color printing. And I thought, well, I'll bring a sample home and show it to my dad. I bring it home. And he always had his engraver's loop around somewhere. And he pulled his loop out, and he looked at it, and he looked at it, looked up at me, didn't have much of a smile on his face, and he said, Charles, and when my dad said Charles, that was not good news. He said, it doesn't look very good, you know. And I said, I know, Dad, I know. I just wanted to show you something early. I said, we're going to get it. I know we are. I said, okay. About 6 months to a year later, we had, in fact, made some great breakthroughs, and I brought home a sample. And it was a sample produced from plates that we had produced and then on a printing press. And he took out his loop, and he looked at it, and he looked at it, and he looked at it. Big grin on his face, and he said, Charlie, you've finally done it. And that, to me, was the biggest reward I ever got from founding Adobe. So those are my remarks. I thank you for your kind attention, and I'd love to entertain questions about anything that I can answer for you, not just about Adobe, but anything that you're interested in that you think I might have had some experience with. Thank you very much. Don't be shy. Dr. Spencer says if you don't ask questions, you don't get an A. We have a mic here in the middle.
It's a bit of a hassle to walk up and use it, but if you don't mind, over here.
All right. Okay, cool. I was just curious about your opinion on acquisitions. You know, I mean, do you believe that after a certain point, you know, a large company to stay competitive, in order to keep its competitive edge, you know, it feels necessary to acquire smaller companies, you know, in terms of, you know, maybe their technology or something like that?
Right. We, in fact, do many acquisitions, most of which the public and our investors pay no attention to because they're typically small technology things. They could be half a dozen people, they could be 2 people who've developed some critical technology that we think is very innovative. We haven't done it internally. We make an offer to them to buy, in effect, buy their business and have them become part of Adobe. That's often where some of those satellite offices that I mentioned come from, because people want to stay where they are and still do the work. And those have been very effective, very valuable to us as a company, and relatively easy to do. The next stage is when you get up to a large company, and in particular a public company. And those are much more problematic, even though they can have tremendous impact. And we've done 3 major public acquisitions in our lifetime. The first was Aldis Corporation from Seattle. It was extremely difficult because the cultures turned out in subtle ways to be very different. And I don't want to take the time to go through all of that. We can do that offline if you really want to. But it was a very difficult job to merge the 2 cultures. The Seattle folks were very different in the way their business was run, in the way that they interacted with one another. And so that integration took a long time. We lost a lot of the Aldis people during that process because they couldn't reacculturate themselves to the way we did business. But we did get one very great product out of it, which is InDesign, which allowed us to recapture a piece of the market that Aldis had lost to a company called Quark, which is the company that did the hostile takeover attempt on us. That's the only time we've ever actually gone into somebody else's market, and we now have 60 to 70% of that marketplace. So that was good. We acquired another company that was very local, right across the street from us. Not much of a cultural problem, but the company was called FrameMaker. They build a very high-end publishing system that runs primarily on Unix workstations. Had a significant market share, mostly in engineering and manufacturing businesses. Turned out that the hardest thing there was that the technology was not at all compatible with our technology. So it was like running a parallel development team that couldn't share much with the core technologies that Adobe had developed and spread throughout our product line. So that was difficult, and I can't honestly say that we ever made much value out of that acquisition. The most recent acquisition that we've done, and by far the largest in terms of financial, was a $3.5 billion acquisition, was of Macromedia. And that, by contrast, has gone extremely well. We've not only retained most of the senior management that we wanted to retain, particularly in the marketing and engineering side of the company, but some of them have moved in the very top, more senior roles in Adobe in terms of management. Their products are all completely integrated with ours now. It really opened up a whole new arena for us in terms of presence on the web with Flash and other technologies, and a new technology platform that we've just introduced called Air, which is the Adobe integrated runtime for the web that we think will begin to blur the distinction between software that runs on your desktop and software that runs on the web. Macromedia I would grade as an A. It was a very good acquisition. A lot of work, a lot of pain involved, but you really have to understand the different kind of acquisitions you're going to make in terms of how you prepare to execute them, and I think we're now at a level of maturity where we sort of know what we're getting into. Okay. Sure. I think you have to use the mic, though.
So one of I would guess that the piece of software that most people use that they're familiar with from Adobe that you basically give away for free is, of course, the Acrobat Reader. And so, as I say, this is a product you give away for free. As I understand it, you recently placed the Adobe standard, became an ISO standard, an international standard, so you no longer control it. I'd be interested if you could tell us a little bit about your decision on why you gave this up, why you made it as sort of a public domain standard. There are now going to be other people, there are other people producing software that produces PDF format files, that reads PDF format files. Microsoft, your old friend, produces PDF format files. I think it would be interesting if you told us a little bit about how you arrived at this decision.
Sure. That's one we get asked an awful lot. And the first and most direct question we always get asked is, how can you make money off of something when you give it away? Well, that wasn't the original plan, actually, but it turned out to have been, for us, a great decision. So let me back up just a little bit. The first technology that we built at the company was called PostScript. It was a language for interfacing between computers and printers. It executes inside the printing device typically, although it doesn't have to. And when we decided to put that out, we decided to do exactly the opposite of what Xerox did. We published the standard 3 months before we introduced the first product. And we did that because in order for a standard to work, people on both ends have to begin supporting it. You can't have one half without the other. Right? If there's only a product to consume the standard but nothing to produce it, nothing happens. So you got to have both, and the only way to do that was to open it up to a variety of producers. So we published PostScript, and PostScript in fact now is, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure if it's ANSI or ISO, but it's one of those, and it's out there, and it has done extremely well for us. It's still a $200 million business, which is not very big compared to the overall size of our company, but it's extremely profitable and is an important ingredient in the overall solutions we provide. So around 1990, John and I were talking about things that we could do that would be new and different, and we said, it's sort of silly in this electronic world that you produce something electronically on a computer, a document, you print it on paper, you send the paper by U.S. Mail or Federal Express, or you fax it, and you store it in a file cabinet, and none of that makes any sense. Why not retain the information electronically, let the people who want to put it on paper print it themselves, but not have the publisher or the distributor of the information make that decision for them? Costs a lot less to buy a disk drive in the middle of Manhattan and store it electronically than it does to buy a file cabinet and store the paper. All right? And on and on and on, and there's no obsolete inventory and all that kind of good stuff. That's where the basic idea for Acrobat came from. And we actually introduced Acrobat in 1993, before the internet had taken off, believing that corporations would understand that since they already had 3Com and Novell networks in their business, that they would understand how to ship this stuff around and would start using it in the way that we intended. Well, unfortunately, it was very hard for people to make that connection. So until the internet came out, Acrobat was sort of languishing. It was not making us a profit. And what happens then inside a company is that all the antibodies line up and decide that this is a disease that needs to be killed. Okay? And so everybody who had a profitable business like Photoshop, and at that time our printing business and that, said, don't spend money on that. Don't give them new hires. Give it to us. We're the people making the money. And that's where you really have to have leadership, not just management in a company. And John and I said, no, our gut tells us that this is going to succeed. It's just a question of when. So we dug our heels in, didn't give the other people the money, we gave it to Acrobat, and eventually it started to get consumed. And before long, we were getting tens of millions of downloads a day of Acrobat, people consuming it because it was free. Originally, we tried to charge $50, and people said, nah, not going to pay that. We'll pay you several $100s to produce these files, but not just to read them and distribute them. If you want to distribute them, that has to be for free. So we made that decision. Today, Acrobat is our fastest growing business, our most profitable, and our largest. And because we publish the standard, we invite competition. So we began in roughly, let's say, 95 when it started to take off, with 100% market share. I don't know what our market share is today, but my suspicion is it's still close to 90. And as long as we produce the best quality products that are built around Acrobat, people continue to buy from us. And they buy primarily in volume licensing in major businesses because they want the ability to do all of the added value things that are done on Acrobat, which is not just looking at a document or even creating it. It's interchanging and commenting on it, doing review processes, encrypting it, sending out information with digital signatures and all of that stuff. So that's what we decided, that's what we did. It was a painful decision, and at least to date, it seems to be working for us very well. But like anything, if we don't have the next good idea, and we aren't already innovating and introducing it to the market, we won't survive and succeed. And so that's why this new platform for the web, which I call AIR, or we call AIR, is something that we're very focused on now in generating that. And we already have millions of users of that technology, so we're hoping that it will do very well. Yes?
So that's a perfect segue to the question I had. So first of all, thanks for a very wonderful talk, but you mentioned two guys in a garage. That's one of the things that keeps you up at night. So I've always seen Adobe as a very innovative company. However, I'm really curious as to, when you get into the syndrome of large companies kind of doing more sustaining innovation than anything that's really kind of earth-shaking and industry-changing, you seem to have done a good job of that. I'm wondering how much open innovation does a company in practice, specifically things like Procter & Gamble and Larry Houston and examples, Moby and things like that have done?
Well, first of all, some companies do what, say, Google does. They say 1 out of 5 days a week, you do whatever you want. We're a little more disciplined because we make commitments to customers that products will ship at a certain time, and people build their business depending on our ability to do that. So we're not quite that laissez-faire about it. But what we do is encourage people to do two things. One is to do as much innovation as their schedule will allow them to do. We don't stifle them. They may do it on their own. They may do it from home, wherever they do it. And secondly, we provide constant examples of people who have done innovation, who have gotten their ideas into products. And sometimes they don't come out as a separate product, but they come out as an enhancement to a product that's already there. And so some of the most innovative things that keeps a product like Photoshop in such a leadership position are innovations that were done inside the company by people who just had an idea. They go off and innovate it. If they do that, we typically give them some restricted stock. We find other ways to reward them. And more importantly, they get their name on the package that says that they've done something. So it's really the ability to provide enough flexibility that the people who are good at doing it are given the opportunity. And let me give you one sort of description about how we think about it as a business. We say in our engineering, primarily engineering, although it sometimes involves folks from the marketing side as well, is that people fall into three categories. There are arrow shooters, there are scouts, and there are road builders. An arrow shooter is a person who has an idea. He says, I think that would be really cool. And he can sort of conjecture what the idea is, and he knows that what he wants to do is shoot the arrow and have it land out there in the jungle somewhere. But he can't quite figure out how to pull it together. So he begins to work with a couple of scouts. And scouts are really good at tracking through the jungle and proving that they can find out where the arrow landed. They don't pay a lot of attention to all the niceties and simplicities of things that may not always work reliably, but they can get there very fast. And once they've done that, they can demonstrate to people whether or not the idea has merit, because it's good enough to do that. And then we as a company make a decision that's something we want to put out in the marketplace. Then we bring in the road builders. The road builders don't shoot arrows. They don't do things very fast. They do them very reliably. and they build a highway from where that arrow was shot to where the arrow landed. Now, the truth is that every person can at one point in their working career be an arrow shooter, a scout, or a road builder. What you can never let happen is have somebody think they're an arrow shooter when they're being supposed to be a road builder and all the other variations on that. And that's what management and leadership in the company has to do. And we encourage everyone to be an arrow shooter. There are a lot of people who just know they're not arrow shooters. There are a lot of people who are really happy and incredibly good at just being road builders. They know how to take the well-defined idea and make it, faster, better, more reliable than anybody else, and that's where they get their pride. And as long as everybody's happy with that, they all get rewarded the same way. You don't get paid more just because you're an arrow shooter, or you don't get paid less if you're, quote, just a road builder. And they all have high respect in the company.
So my question sort of builds off of that. An innovative company has sort of two strategies. There's exploration, there's exploitation. Exploration to sort of develop your technical capabilities, and exploitation is honing those capabilities towards specific market opportunities. Can you comment on the challenges of balancing exploration and exploitation as the startup company that left Xerox and then now as the current leading innovator, and how you sort of act that way in response to the future little companies that are going to splinter off?
Right. Well, if you go back to my little bit of a story about what things were like when we started, John and I had a pretty good idea that what we were working on generically was something that didn't require a lot more exploration. It mostly required being the road builders who could take the idea from where it was conceived to getting it finished. And so in that regard, what we thought a lot about was the exploitation part at the same time we were doing it. Now, it's, as I told you, its definition got changed. Let's ignore that for the moment. That was just a happy circumstance of encounters that we got and good advice. But once we had the idea of what we were doing, then we spent a lot of time thinking about exploitation. So we had the deal with Apple, we had the deal with Linotype, and I talked mostly about the typeface agreement, but at the same time we also did a typesetting agreement with them. So they would build the machines that did the printing plates that were proofed on a laser writer. And we decided, who else do we go after? We went after the Japanese. We were strongly encouraged to go after IBM. We said no. That's the last company we want to go for. And in fact, it wasn't the last one. The last one we really wanted to go for was HP. But we kept putting them off and going to other people first because we knew that unless we had already established ourselves, they would negotiate us to a position and a price that would make it unprofitable for us, probably. And we wouldn't have the horsepower to stand up to them. So in fact, that's what we did. We finally got a deal with IBM. And within less than a week, the phone call came from Palo Alto, from HP, saying, let's talk. And that's the way we did exploitation, is we just incrementally went out and got enough presence in the marketplace that we could eventually get to the big guys, and then from there to all of the Japanese manufacturers and so on. How you do that, I don't know how you plan to do that. For us, it was more or less more instinct than planning, to be perfectly candid, except for the things I talked about in terms of the order in which we went after those companies.
You mentioned managers and leaders. Could you elaborate a little bit on the difference between the two?
So, the function of leaders is to build more leaders, not more followers. And the difference between leadership and management is the difference in terms of the culture that you build. And if you hire people who are extremely bright and are extremely capable and have their own ideas of what needs to be done, you do have to spend some time at management, which is primarily to infuse in them the idea of communication, not only vertically but horizontally, and then to mostly stay out of their way and make sure they have all the resources to get their job done. The job of a leader is to formulate a vision and to sell that vision to enough people to get the right resources aligned to bring the vision to reality. And it's a lot easier to hire managers than it is leaders. And leaders are very unique, hard to identify, but they make all the difference. And leadership can be in a whole variety of areas. It doesn't have to be in engineering. It doesn't have to be in the standard management ladder. It's often individual contributors that can be leaders because they have a vision of how to make something happen, and they can attract a set of people to work with them and do that. We have a dual ladder system, particularly in our engineering side. You can either go up the management chain in engineering, or you can go up in terms of being a more senior engineer and computer scientist. And we reward them comparably and make sure that people who want to manage have that opportunity, and people who don't can still be incredibly successful and incredibly influential in the company as a leader in their field or their area. But they're not the same thing.
Hello, Dr. Geschke.
I'm Chuck.
Chuck. Hi, Chuck. I'm Mike. You've spoken about innovation and intellectual capital and standards bodies, and I'm curious as to whether patents have played a significant role at any point in the development of the company.
Right. When we started Adobe, software was not patentable. That was a much saner world. During Adobe's early years, that process began to change, and people began filing patents on everything under the sun. The U.S. Patent Office does not have the talent or the resources to figure out whether a patent is valid or not. It can only be done now in litigation, which is incredibly expensive, incredibly distracting. It's probably one of the worst things that's happened in the software industry, because there are relatively few patentable things that are actually discovered in software. Most of the things that are trying to be patented are closer to processes than they are inventions. And they may be user interface models or visual representations, but they're not really the essence of a patent. And in particular, because the patent environment has become so perverse, they don't achieve the primary purpose of patents, which was to teach other people skilled in the field what new technology could be employed and give the inventor a finite period of time to exploit that. Because now, today, we will not allow any of our engineers to read any patents. So its communication purpose is wasted. And the worst thing that's happening now, in my humble opinion, is that there are some companies and organizations for profit who are what we call patent trolls. People who do not invent anything, but they buy patents and then extort money from companies who, if they don't pay them, will be sued for things that that company never invented. And they are typically sued in a courthouse in East Texas. If you guys in Austin could fix that, I'd appreciate that very much. So, you know, patents are now just a pain. They're really, we never depended upon patents. We depended on trade secret. And if you're dependent on trade secret, it's why stock options are so important. Because everybody who really, quote, invented something at Adobe, it was kept as a trade secret, but that person owned the company. And so it was not in their own self-interest to divulge that information to anybody else. And that's the way we've protected our intellectual property.
Just two quick questions. One is, how did you come up with the name Adobe? And then also, what technologies or technology excites you the most right now, either at Adobe or elsewhere? Okay. And finally, thank you for what you and Adobe have done for everyone that touches a computer. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. As I said, that's why that's the best reward you can give me. The name Adobe. Well, when you start a company in California, first of all, John and I decided we did not want to pick a name that was totally representative of what we planned to do, because we figured, A, it's likely going to change, and B, it would probably be too limiting in terms of the scope of building a company. So we didn't want to have anything about printing or any of that kind of stuff in our name. Next, we went off to the Board of Corporations in California with a bunch of name proposals that we pulled out of thin air. And pretty much everything that we liked was already taken. A lot of companies. So I thought back to our days at Park, and we used to name the projects that we got engaged in. And there was not uniformity in this, but a lot of us used the technique. There was a map of California out in the hallway, and a fairly detailed map with lots of towns and everything on it. And we'd take a dart and throw it at the map, and whatever it hit, that was the code name for the project. So I was thinking one day at home about maps, and I happened to be looking at a map of the community I live in, Los Altos, and I noticed that there was this creek that went through the town, and it was sort of close to my house and sort of close to John's, and the name of the creek was Adobe Creek. So that's where the name came from. In the early days, lots of people assumed that we were based in New Mexico, for obvious reasons, even though Adobe is a very good California word. Now I've talked so long about that I forgot the other question. Oh, what technologies excite me the most? Frankly, mostly green technologies, things in the area of not just alternative energy, which I think is interesting too, but green things. I mean, the story that captured me to start thinking about this more and more was a little bizarre and very mundane. Someone explained to me that one of the most power-consumptive things we do in ordinary house building is manufacture plasterboard. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to build plasterboard. And there are lots of great alternatives that have all the right properties. And so there are a couple of startups that have been started and funded by Silicon Valley to bring out an alternative to plasterboard. And I said, my God, if we just started thinking about that, what a tremendous impact we could have. And then I was at a talk at the Commonwealth Club, actually, and the CEO of PG&E, that's Pacific Gas and Electric, that's the Northern California major utility supplier, began to talk about some statistics that I had never heard about, never focused on. And it all started right after the first Arab oil crisis back in the 70s, where the state of California decided that never again were they going to become victimized as badly as they were in that case by the amount of energy that we were consuming as a state. And so they began enforcing laws on energy efficient appliances, CAFE standards for automobiles, all the things that have been done over the last couple of decades in this area. And they pushed it really hard, and they refused to back off, which is one of the reasons the current skirmish with the federal government is so annoying to Californians. The net result of that is that the per capita use of energy in California has remained constant for over 30 years. Think about that. And we use more because there are more people, but the per capita use has remained constant. That's something the entire United States could do just by focusing on it. So that's the stuff that interests me, is how do we, there's not going to be one big bang that's going to fix this thing. Okay, we have to do a lot of things, and a lot of them are very achievable. They don't require rocket scientists to implement them. They just require leadership, not management. Yes?
Hi, Chuck. I'm Elizabeth. I've worked on both sides of a transition of legacy or older products, both as an offshore programmer and as a programmer in the U.S. You mentioned that you have operations in India and that there the people are working on older products.
That's some of what they do.
Well, some of it, right. And they also do some very innovative things as well. I was curious how you handled the transition from the transition of the older products from your domestic developers over to the people of India, the developers in India, while maintaining the Adobe way.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's a very rare event, sorry, tongue-tied, very rare event at Adobe for us to fact, I can't remember the last time we've laid off anybody who was a strong contributor in the company. So as products transition, the people who are engaged in them, we actively encourage and ask our people who are recruiting new employees to go off and look at the talent that's coming free, because their products may be becoming less critical in the market. They may be moving to a different development site like India, and we get them engaged in that. So I won't tell you that we've never had layoffs at Adobe. We certainly have, and certainly when we've done major mergers, there's been a lot of duplication that had to be eliminated, and we have done that. But we view those capital assets, the brains of the people who have made our business successful, as our most precious commodity internally. And we work very hard to get them relocated into other jobs. Sometimes people are so attached to what they do that they just can't live with change. And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten up in company meetings and talk about change. And I tell people, you gotta love change. We're all about change. This entire valley is built on change. If you can't deal with change, we love you, but you probably need to do something else because you're going to get frustrated. Change is what it's all about. And so we try to instill that early, and that is part of the Adobe way. But we are very sensitive to that process of migrating products because it does cause people to find new things to do. And I could point out dozens of stories of people whose careers actually flourished after being moved on to something new to do because they sort of get re-energized. I mean, there is the burden of history that you have to deal with. And, you know, they say that the only reason, now I am not a creationist, I just want to say that up front, but the only reason that God was able to build the world in 7 days is he didn't have an install base.
Thank you.
Hi, Chuck and Camilo. And my question is, how did your leadership style change from when you were a private company to when you were in a public company?
Well, let me first tell you how it changed when I went from Xerox to founding Adobe. At Xerox, I had a whole bunch of people to answer, and had I stayed a little longer, Bill would have been one of them. And so you spend a lot of time communicating upwards. The advantage of starting a business is that, except for shareholders and those other little details, you're mostly communicating downward. And from the beginning, our philosophy that, you know, sort of has changed over time, I suppose, at some level, but not dramatically, is that we had the attitude that everyone swept the floors. So when we hired the first employees, when they came to their office, there were no shelves on the wall. We had pieces of wood that were already finished, brackets, a hammer and a screwdriver, and your first job was to hang your shelves because we weren't going to hire somebody to do that. And that was sort of the philosophy, is that everybody sort of took care of sweeping the floors and keeping the business going. And that style of leadership requires that if you're going to pull it off, then the leaders need to do it too. Okay, there can't be a difference in that regard, so everybody had to do that. As we started to go public, then you become much more, have to become much more careful about keeping information that we used to talk about to anybody private, because in fact it has potentially an impact on the market. And so teaching ourselves to adopt the disciplines of a public company, where no longer did everybody in the company know exactly how we were doing, and you know, we had 16 B officers who were segregated from other people and could only trade stock at certain times, and all of that was something, frankly, that John and I had to learn on the job. And what we've tried to do continuously is keep everything that could be open, and have no information withheld from anybody, except to the extent that it would run afoul of the regulatory agencies. And that process was a little difficult because some of the people who were there very early felt like all of a sudden that information was being hidden from them, and it was, because it had to be. And but we talked about that as a company. Once people saw their stock beginning to split and double and all that, they became less concerned about that issue. Yeah.
You've given us several examples of the distributed innovation processes that Adobe has leveraged through, just global offices or acquisitions. And my question is, do universities, either in the U.S. or abroad, play any role in the development of new products? And what do those relationships look like, either the sources of innovation or is it just a talent pipeline?
Right. Well, they participate in certain ways. We have a very strong relationship, it turns out, with the University of Washington up in Seattle. And in fact, there are a couple of faculty members who are sort of a combination of adjunct professors and adjunct employees, as it were. I'm sure that's not the term we actually use. And some of the laboratory work that they do there is in fact focused around things that they believe will be of interest to Adobe. And when it makes sense, we adopt some of that technology. If the university has filed a patent on it, then we pay them royalties and we do that. We've also begun to develop a very aggressive intern program where we bring in over the summer undergraduates, graduate students, get them working at Adobe so we get to know them better and so that we understand where the best people are coming from, and we try to go out to hire them. So we definitely do that in terms of our process of recruitment. And when we were a young company, people used to comment about the fact is that we mostly hired people who were our age. And the reason we did that is we didn't have the resources or the time to train the people. What we needed to do is hit the ground running. And so we hired people that we had networked with from years before. Some were from Xerox, some were from Stanford, a variety of different places, because as people began to join the company, they had relationships with other people. And we built the company that way. And we didn't become aggressive about recruiting from universities until we were close to 10 years old, because we didn't feel we had the capacity to give them an environment in which they could grow up in the world of business. And my advice in those days always was for people graduating, go get a job at HP or Intel or IBM or someplace. Leave behind all your bad ideas with them and then come work for us. And that worked pretty well.
You talked earlier about Acrobat Reader and how giving it away for free basically led you to capture all of the market share. And I guess the other product that comes to mind for me would be Flash. So as you know, the rich internet application world kind of expands and new products like Silverlight are entering the market, just wondering if you guys have plans to monetize it or what your overall strategy is going to be.
Well, that's a great question, because the answer actually for both Flash and Acrobat are remarkably similar. They probably differ in the details. The objective in both cases was to get an install base eventually of billions of things that are in that format. The advantage of that is that it's very hard to dislodge. You can dislodge a product with another product by using better marketing and maybe build a slightly better version of that technology, but you can't simply wipe out an install base. And so today there are millions, if not billions, certainly, in fact, I know it's billions, of documents in PDF format. If you actually count the pages, there's trillions. And Flash, hundreds and hundreds of millions of videos out there. Most of what you see on the web in terms of video is Flash. And the advantage that gives us, and shame on us, if we can't build a market around that. So the tools to build them, tools to integrate the Flash content or the Acrobat content into other things. The entire printing and publishing industry uses an Acrobat workflow, which is one of the places we sell a lot of products, where things that used to go through various printing phases and review and everything, it's all done electronically now. The entire workflow is all electronic. You never see a sheet of paper until they decide that it's time to publish the material. So we build upon those standards, and having that install base makes it very hard for Microsoft or someone else to compete with us, directly head on in establishing that standard. So what Microsoft did, which is, they don't do this very often, by supporting Acrobat, they actually acknowledged that they can't compete with that particular technology. And, you know, and this is the aggressive part of me, Microsoft has never innovated anything in its entire career, entire lifetime. And we innovate like hell, and I love that, because then they eventually have to follow us, And Bill, you better stop me there before I get too aggressive.
I think we should thank Chuck